Hello and welcome to this video where we'll be focusing on Eurorack mixing, techniques for mixing in modular, while demoing the Cosmix Pro from Cosmotronic. Let's check out what's to come. This video is sponsored by Cosmotronic. Now in this video we'll look at Eurorack mixing techniques for building mixes, be they ambient, droning, feedback based, or techno, driving and some added distortion kind of mixing. We'll also look at techniques like using auxiliary sends, using channels to bring effects back in to build feedback loops, building up parallel compression, using feedback distortion, and just making the most of mixing in a Eurorack environment with patches and ideas that you can take away and try for yourselves. We'll be doing so while demoing the Cosmix Pro, the new mixer from Cosmotronic, which has been a really clean, high headroom mixer that's been really playable and performable, and I've really enjoyed the kind of quality and just clean fidelity that the module offers. So running down the features here of the Cosmix Pro, channels 1 to 4 have an auxiliary 1 send, auxiliary 2 send, a pan control, mutes, we have level indicators, level sliders, and we have a low cut. And these low cuts on the first 4 channels are simple 6 dB per octave high pass filters meant to clean up a mix. Channels 5 and 6, instead of being mono, are stereo. You don't have an auxiliary 1 control, you do still have an auxiliary 2 control, a pan to balance a stereo image, and you can just plug a mono signal into the left input and that will just work in mono too. Level controls, level indicators, which we can see here, but instead of the low cut, these have 18 dB additional gain boosts. And you can use these to bring in external line level gear, just add more level to anything that needs it, or as I'm going to do, as well as using it for line level gear with a vintage synth, you can push this into distortion. It's an otherwise very clean high headroom mixer, but the addition of that gain allows you to do some fun distortion tricks as well. Auxiliary 2 is a true stereo output. So if we create a different pan and an actual stereo image here, whatever we put out of auxiliary 2, just like the main output, will retain that stereo image. This is good for true stereo effects, or just generally stereo routing around a system. We have a main output, with its own control and its own LED meters, and these stereo channels 5 and 6 have CV controlled pans. And while we're talking about pan, there's an interesting and quite different pan curve here, where the panning really is quite focused in terms of being mono and just offside of mono, and then at the extremes it kind of pushes out more hard left and right. As many of you will be aware of these kind of mixer features, this video is really going to focus, as I said earlier, on making patches, modular mixing, building parallel compression chains, feedback distortions, and being creative with your mixing in a Eurorack environment. Patch examples have been on the screen, so without further ado, let's dive in. So here I'm going to kind of dissect this techno mix. I have drums, I've set up an auxiliary here to give me some parallel compression, and this extra kind of shuffling, panning bass line, if you like. Here's my kick drum coming in, nothing fancy happening here. Snare drum on channel 2, hi-hat on channel 3, and these 3 drums are actually coming out of aux 1, which is purple cable here, into Mesa, the Cosmotronic compressor. And I want to create a parallel, or quote, New York style compression here. So by using channel 4 to come back in on, I'm sending the drums, kick, snare and hi-hat out of aux 1 to the compressor. This is coming back to channel 4, and listen to how much this adds extra weight and kind of punch. I mean, we can make it really massive. The compression is set really aggressive, really full on, limiting 30 to 50 milliseconds of attack. I can choose which sounds actually go into the parallel compression, just the snare for example, the kick, but as well as blending a mix of them, say not much hat, plenty of kick and a good amount of snare. I actually feed back channel 4 and listen to what happens to the low end. You actually get this kind of complementary clipping swell, if you like. Channel 5 is a scattering, heavily modulated sound. I'm using this green trace here on data, which is just a delta V envelope to the panning. So I've gone all the way left and letting a positive voltage turn that back right. I'm using aux 2, mono out here because it's a mono input effect. The effects aid for a big reverb, coming back on channel 6 again so I can feedback loop. Feedback is really important to how I like working in a modular. So being able to take a sound like that, feed the reverb back on itself, becomes a really performative aspect of a patch. Now in this patch we have a little bit of a hack to get CV controlled auxiliary sends. Now we don't have any auxiliary CV on the Cosmix Pro, but we can work around using this true stereo aux 2 that will retain a stereo image and then make use of the pan CV to work like an auxiliary CV controlled send. My main sound on channel 1 is this plucked string melody, and there's some probabilities and randomizations in this sound. You'll hear it change over time. That sound is split into channel 5. That's currently panned all the way hard left, and my effects are coming in stereo on channel 6. Now this aux 2 bus is true stereo, meaning anything we send to it will retain its stereo image out of the stereo aux 2 output. And because I'm panned all the way left, there's no sound on this right output to actually send to my effects. So if I pan across to the right, that's sending the image to the right, to that right-hand output on aux 2, and then feeding my effects chain. If I modulate the panning, it will simply modulate across, feeding some sound to the right that then feeds my effects. I'm using CV to send the sound to the right, effectively sending to my effects. Watch out for some random gates firing, you'll hear the effects and you'll see them on the scope and the LED cable. Now, the kind of caveat here, or the downside, is that I have to have my sound panned left and pan across right to actually hit that effects output. So by adding the dry sound in on channel 1 and panning to the right, I can have a more balanced stereo image for the dry sound, but still use the panning on here. Which does mean briefly all my dry sound will shift to the right as it then feeds the effects. It certainly works in this ambient mix for me. Adding in my bass again. And there we have a little patch hack to give us CV controlled sends by taking advantage of that true stereo aux 2 bus. Now as the stereo channels 5 and 6 have an additional 18 dB of gain on these gain switches, rather than having low cuts on these mono channels, I thought we'd distort some sounds. Now removing my envelope, I have a pitch sequenced oscillator through a low pass filter that's currently clean, coming into channel 5. Now if I crank 18 more decibels through the channel though, oof. We can tame this back by reducing the channel level to be cleaner and of course quieter. Or a bit of distortion, or just go full on. Let's put the envelope back into the filter here. Have a kick drum on channel 6 just so we can hear a different sound. Clean sound there. Let's pump in another 18 dB of gain. And of course that would work on stereo signals, as channels 5 and 6 are stereo inputs. If we flip the panel over, we can not only see some really nice PCB art here, we can also see we have input and output expanders. And Cosmotronic have said that there are connections on the back to chain up more than one Cosmix Pro. It's compatible with the original Cosmix 2, so it's a great way to expand your setup without having to completely replace an existing module. Possible expanders in the future could include an EQ, a saturation module, an output summing module, and balanced outputs and headphones. So it'll be interesting to see where Cosmotronic take this. So this patch built up around the idea of feedback patching and building drones, all with lots of independent, unsynced movement and some feedback that's just going to add to this pulsing, kind of ebbing drone. We start with this voice from Free Body in channel 1, which is the yellow cabling here. There's some LFOs moving between some phase and FM modulation, giving us this nice complex digital style drone sound. I'm splitting the sound here, or either taking a different output, which is a phase shifted sine wave, up to paradigm, the Cosmotronic distortion there, and driving this and modulating it with another unsynced LFO. This is panned right, so together we have a stereo signal. The right side is more distorted, has some separate movement, and the difference between these waves is what actually gives us this white curve here, this Lissajous XY scope. But moving on to channel 5 here, I'm taking one of the modulators, one of the oscillators here from Free Body, running that through a VCA that's just been faded up and down, and I'm using another LFO to then pan it, removing that. It's just a static mono sound, and the LFO just giving us this gentle swaying from side to side. Have a Cyrus here as another sound source. This is being modulated in a bandpass filter there from Danny Sound, and together they just give this free-running, pulsing bit of movement. Around auxiliary 1 I have a reverb, which I'm mainly feeding off the distorted paradigm version of my drone. Coming out of aux 1 there, orange cables, and back in stereo into the return. And it's a nice big effects-aid reverb. I'm then using auxiliary 2 to create a feedback loop. I'm coming out in stereo from auxiliary 2, back into my stereo strip module. I'm modulating both the level and the panning. This is from the Delta V, just free running LFOs here. And we can see and hear this swell. You can watch the LEDs there or on stereo strip, and hopefully you can hear them being panned around. And it's feeding back by sending channel 6, which is where this sound returns, again stereo strip, red cables into 6, feeding it back out on itself. Add some reverb back in. there's some feedback and some nice evolving drones. So here I have a mix built up on the Cosmix Pro, making use of pedals, line level gear, and modular effects. I'm also kind of adding an extra channel here, if you like, by using the return for some just standard audio rather than effects. So let me mute everything and I'll go through what's going on. The first three channels are my drums, and channel 1 is the kick, channel 2 is kind of nice scrape and rattle that plays into a more standard kind of knocky snare sound on channel 3. I'm coming out of auxiliary 1, it's the green cable here, to a Vino echo that's underneath the SH09. This synth is on top of my modular case, just kind of resting. Maybe not ideal, but it's going into a stereo echo, the Vino echo module, and that's coming back into the stereo returns. As I add that to this kind of rattle sound, we'll hear this start to move around in stereo, and it's just adding to that kind of crunch and noise for this really wonky beat. I then have this sequenced arpeggio, and that's coming on these purple cables here, going through this little instro fader, and I'm actually coming into the mono input. I wasn't sure if I was going to need channel 4, so I'd patched into here and just sent this sound in and given myself an extra channel by losing that mono return. So as I turn this up, this is that sound. Channel 5 is my SH09, and I've enabled the extra 18 dB of level to bring in this line level vintage synth straight into Eurorack levels in the Cosmix. And I have on channel 6 some pedal effects, and by being careful with the amount of auxiliary level I send, this is coming out of auxiliary 2, into the pedal, into the other pedal, and back into channel 6, I've enabled 18 dB of gain, just to pull this lower pedal level up to Eurorack levels. And if I'm careful with how much level I send, it works fine. And by bringing effects back into channels, as I have done several times in this video, we can actually add feedback by sending the effects back onto itself. Get some really lovely feedback trails. So bringing the mix back in together. I'd love to know which one of these techniques or patches was your favourite. Let me know what you liked in the comments. If you'd like to join the DivKid Discord community, gain access to exclusive videos, patchbook PDFs and more, check out patreon.com/DivKid where you can support my work. That's it for now. Thanks, and I'll see you next time. Bye.